Dr. Rufus, good evening.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, Joe, sir. So happy to have you here with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I'm also happy to be here this evening.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah. We'll start now, sir.
Oh, yes, fine.
Yes, thank you. Uh, so here we start. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to another edition of Books and Coffee. This is the 8th edition and we have successfully navigated through a whole lot of wonderful delegates who have given us enriching, engaging and enlightening presentations for us. And this evening we have with us 4 wonderful delegates from different fields, I should say. One is Ms. Usha Alagappan from the American Center, Chennai. And the next one is an architect, a well-known architect from Chennai, Mr. L. Venkatesh. And then Professor Christina Dhanasekaran, my own colleague in Madras Christian College. And then Professor Yasmin from Yamini from Sri Venkateshwara College of Arts and Science, Gauri Vakam, Chennai. So just a brief little introduction before I hand it over to Ms. Usha Alagappan. We started as a little reading group in the year 2017. And we thought of sharing whatever we read. It could be a newspaper article, it could be Reader's Digest, it could be a novel, a novella, or a short story, or anything that we read. We thought of sharing it. And we believed in this dictum, we share and we grow together. So ever since, today we have around 50 or 52 groupies in our garden. We believe in nurturing each other, appreciating each other, and celebrating. The main objective of the group is bring the book back to the reader. And with this objective in mind, we are progressing in that direction. And I hope with the mutual enthusiastic participation of everyone over here, we will make this Books and Coffee meet also a great success. With this little introduction, let me hand over the session to Ms. Usha Alagappan from the American Center, Chennai. Over to you, Ms. Usha Alagappan.
Thank you, Dr. Rufus. Thank you for inviting me. Good evening, all. It is an honor to be in this virtual room today. You are the allied group of professors, research scholars, students, and book lovers. I'm sure many of the professors would have visited our center. And most of the students feel that everything under the sun is available in the Google, right? But it is not the case. We have access to a few specialized databases which will help you in your research work. Today, I'm going to showcase these resources mainly to you so that it will help in your research. Before I begin my demo, let me briefly about our center. Our center is situated at the Gemini flyover. It is inside the American consulate. If you want to visit, right now the center is closed. So due to the, so if you want to, when we open and if you want to visit our center, you need to come with a government issued photo ID card if you're a non-student. If you're a student, your college or school ID card is sufficient. It should be valid and original. That is very important to come inside the US consulate. And we also have, we are 73 years old library, and we are one of the 4 centers in India. We have one in Chennai, which caters to all the South Indian audience, that is Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka, Pondicherry, Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And we have one in Mumbai, one in Kolkata, and one in Delhi. And we have around 16,000 books in our collection, 40 journals, more than 500 documentaries and 500 movies in our collection. And we also subscribe to some online databases. When it comes to movies, we have lots of print to screen movies like what you teach in the college, like Old Man and the Sea, Night Mother, Grapes of Wrath, Beloved, To Kill a Mockingbird, Streetcar Named Desire. We have all those classics. And we also do have the recent ones like Hunger Games, Help, Divergent, Maze Runner, those kind of movies also we have in our collection. I take this opportunity to invite the professors to visit us with your students, and you can watch the movie as a group, or you can also watch uh, watch the movie individually. Before and I'm going to showcase the online databases. We work, our working hours are between 9:30 to 5, Monday through Friday. So let me show you the online databases. I'm going to share my screen. One second, let me log in. Though technology is very nice, sometimes it doesn't work. Because of this technology, we all are now sharing the wonderful books that we have read. This is one of the databases. This is called eLibrary US. You have to visit our center to use this database. Since you are welcome to write to us. I will share our email details at the end of this presentation. You can write to us and ask what material you require. We will be happy to send you the full text articles to you. So you can see Press Reader, Gale Academic File, JSTOR. I'm sure many of you would have heard about JSTOR because articles are available in the open source. And we have the most important is ProQuest dissertations. We have around 1.5 million dissertations and theses submitted in 700 universities globally. So many research scholars visit us, use this. We will not be able to send the full text of that or ID. Since because of the copyright regulation, we allow you to print the relevant pages, and we charge 3 rupees per page for printing purpose. So you need to visit just to access the dissertation. The articles, whenever you write, we will be happy to mail the articles to you, the full text, if it is available. You can send the bibliographical details also to you. Environment, or I will go and show something. As I said, it is sometimes it doesn't work. I'm sorry, please bear with me.
That's okay, ma'am. No problem.
It was working perfectly when we were checking, doing the test call.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, it is not working now. So I'll just briefly tell you whatever you are working, you can just search on the keyword, and you'll be able to get the full text of the dissertation, and you can print the relevant pages. We have this Gale Academic 1.5, which has more than 8,000 journals on all subjects. So you can send the full text of article to your email ID. JSTOR, you need to just download them and email the articles. to your ID. We also have two more databases, that is EBSCO. And in EBSCO, we have a specialized database called Literary Reference Center Plus. That also I will not be able to show you. I'm really sorry. I couldn't showcase that to you. So again, if you are working on some topic, you can send the full text of the article to your email ID. On a given day, you can email 50 articles in EBSCO and in ProQuest database also. And in Gale Academic OneFile and all, you will be able to send more, around 100 articles. JSTOR also, you have to download them and you can email the articles. Some interesting resource other than this, we also have access to Project News. That is another wonderful database for the literature researchers. You have a lot of theory available in that Project News, but you will not be able to access them. Only the staff has access. So if you again write to us, we will be able to look into the Project News database and we will send you the full text of articles. That is available. Then, other than these databases, we also do a lot of programming at the American Center, like English language workshops for the professors and school teachers. Then we do communication skills workshop for the students. Then entrepreneurship workshop, cyberbullying. In fact, we did cyberbullying coordinating with the MCC college, with the Department of Journalism. Then we also we do quiz programs for both the colleges and the schools. Every year we used to do. This year we haven't done because of the pandemic. And we do a lot of cultural programs, then panel discussions. All our workshops are free for both the students and the professors. What we do is we contact the professors and we ask them to nominate their students. And you can nominate and the students will be able to participate in our program. Other than this, I will tell you about our membership also. Our membership is only 400 rupees for a year and 700 rupees for 2 years. With your membership, you will be able to borrow 4 books and one back issue of a journal for a period of 4 weeks. And you will be able to ask any material and we will send you the articles. All this will be free as part of your membership. If you do not have much material with us, it's not a problem. Membership is not mandatory. You can always write to us. We will be happy to help you in your research. Then let me show, since I'm unable to show you the paid databases, we have some free resources. Let me at least show you them. This is one of the resource, americanenglish.state.gov. This is a wonderful resource for the English language teachers. And I'm sure many of the students will be doing lots of MOOCs, massive open online courses. There are free courses available through this American English. So you can also register for them. So this is a good resource for both the teachers and the students. So, and there is a mobile app available, which you can download from your Google Play Store. That is called American English Mobile App. And you can play vocabulary games. This will be very helpful for the younger children. And this is a English Teaching Forum magazine. This is a peer-reviewed journal. And all the back issues are free. So you can download them and use them for your research purpose. And there are lots of games, free games are available in the website too. Another good resource will be VOA, that is Voice of America. And you can see lots of free resources available. My favorite will be English in a Minute and English at the Movies. You can download these videos and use them in your classroom too. English in a Minute, it will teach a phrase in a minute with examples. That's a nice video. And English at the movies, they will show the clipping and they will teach you how to use the phrase and all that. So you have everyday grammar, learning English, all this are available. You can make use of them. You can promote this to your students. So are there any questions for me? I'm really sorry. I see there is one question. Is there some way of accessing research resources remotely? We used to provide access to the resources, that is eLibrary in USA, until 2016. But there were not many takers. Not many people used it. So our Washington, D.C. office removed this access. So you have to come to our American Center to access them. But no problem. Please write to us. This is our email ID. Chennai Ref Desk @state.gov. This is our email ID. So you can write to us and we will be happy to send. Let me show you our catalog also. So this is our website. Let me show you the website. There are lots of resources here. You can see the membership details are available and collection and resources. I was talking to you about the documentaries and videos. So you have the video catalog and the feature films catalog, and our online catalog is available in this Union Online Catalog of American Libraries. So you will be able to see not only the books that are available in Chennai, but also in other 3 American centers. As a member, you are eligible to borrow books from the other centers. So if you write to us, we will get the book for you if it is not in Chennai, and we will send the book to your address if you are outside of Chennai. One way we will bear the cost, while returning you will bear the cost. Are there any questions for me?
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Ms. Usha Alagappan, for
Thank you
giving us
so
a
much for
brilliant...
listening.
Yes, ma'am. That was a wonderful orientation to the resources of the American Center. If there are any questions from the participants, you can unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask Ms. Usha Alagappan your questions. There are questions in the chat box, I think, ma'am.
Okay, let me see.
Yes.
No.
No, okay, fine.
Okay, thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. It was a wonderful time with you. Thank you so much for that enriching and enlightening session. Thank you. Now over to Mr. L. Venkatesh. He'll be giving us a review of Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. And no wonder, he's also an architect, a well-known architect from the city. So he's going to talk to us about Invisible Cities. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Rufus. Thank you, Mrs. Alagappan. I hope you can hear me well, and good evening, everybody. So those of you who think that this is going to be a review of cities are going to be a bit disappointed. And let me jump right in. Like all packages, Invisible Cities also like a little small book. I came across it first in 89 or 90 when I was a teaching assistant. And we had this big bunch of books that we need, extract of books that we had to teach first year students of architecture in the US. And this has nothing to do with design, it has nothing to do with creativity, but it was an exposure to students on reading architecture and reading text. And I don't remember much from that extract except 2 things. One was an extract of T.S. Eliot and Calvino's book. I remember the Eliot because I don't know which poem it was. Either it was a wasteland or something on cats. Nothing useful came out of it except that I was able to impress my future wife when I spoke to her the first time. And Professor, I hope you muted her because I'm sure she'd want to do a repartee out here. The second book that I always remembered was Invisible Cities by Calvino. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to also read some extracts from this book and also jump into this book. But it's one of those strange books that remain with me. I didn't look at this book as reading text. I remembered this book as a series of images, and that's kind of understandable because I'm an architect and the thinking is a little more visual than textual. And I kept remembering stories from the book, not really the details, but a lot of visual symbols that just kept running in my head all the time. And I must really thank you for this opportunity because it gave me a chance to go back and read the book. My bookshelf is full of books that I always wanted to go back and read a second time. But we've become prolific book buyers, prolific writers, prolific publishers. So there's never time to go back to a book and read it again because we're constantly reading new stuff, and Kindle doesn't help also. So what I remember about the Eliot poem, and I hate poetry, okay? I still can never forgive that solitary Highland lass. I mean, she made my life miserable. But I remember this poem of Eliot because there was a time in the early 20th century when all forms of art seemed to fuse. There's a lot of interaction. So they were like sculptors were inspired by writers, poets inspired by painters, architects inspired by somebody else. And so there's a whole lot of movement about it, which started with the Bauhaus in Germany, became the international style and modernism, and kind of crystallized in a post-World War II kind of a style of modernism, which was one of the longest living styles, at least in architecture. I don't know what happened to it in literature, etc. But at least in architecture, for well over 30, 40 years, it was the predominant style. And even now, a lot of what we do is based out of seeds that were planted by modernism. And Calvino's book left a lot of memories in me. And very few books have that ability. Like, I still remember the dialogue between Edmond Dantes and Abbe Faria and Count of Monte Cristo, or that moment in Rabindranath Tagore's Gora when Gora's father tells him that he's not his real father. I mean, these are like some iconic moments in literature that remain etched in your mind. So what I'm going to do is, when I read this book, the extract that we taught our students kind of just jumped back in my mind. So I'm just going to read it because it's kind of a very interesting thing. Okay, but before I read it, let me also just do a little boring mathematical part of the book. Now, apparently, Calvino was part of this group of people who were also interested in science, etc. So the book actually has a very funny structure. The book has stories on 55 cities. And there are 11 categories. And these categories are memory, desire, science, like in symbol, SIGNS, think cities, trading cities, cities with eyes, cities with names, cities of the dead, cities in the sky, and then continuous cities and hidden cities. So there are 11 categories, and in each category there are 5 stories. So there are 55 stories out here. And how is it arranged? 9 chapters. The first and 9th chapter have 10 stories each, that's 20. The other 7 chapters are 5, so that's 55 stories. And how is the book structured? The book itself is actually an imaginary dialogue between Kublai Khan and Marco Polo. Typically, each chapter starts with a preamble or a preface discussion between the two of them. Then you have this bunch of stories, and it ends with, again, a discussion between them. And it's kind of really insightful discussion. And the whole thing is imaginary, right? So you know that Kublai Khan is now pictured in this book at the peak of his power. And when he was at the peak of his power, he was ruling over almost 20% of mankind. And a lot of problems that we faced in the last century and continue to face now is because of things that happened during Kublai Khan's time. Like the Indo-China face-off in Pangong Lake is a straight line relationship to Kublai Khan's relationship with this in Tibet. Now, these discussions between the two of them cover a complete gamut of emotion, and it's a study on human nature. It's not a study at an individual level, but at a collective level. So the city kind of becomes a metaphor for individuals, and it therefore becomes a reflection of what individuals do when they interact with each other and they talk to each other. And Kublai Khan is a Mongol, Marco Polo is a European. So how do they talk? The dialogue is set as signs, they use symbols, they use objects, they use games, gestures, settings, and sometimes even silence. And that is how they actually communicate with each other. The first thing that I read about this book was in the extract that we taught our students, and it was on cities and desire. A very interesting thing. So I'll just do a quick reading of it. It's about a city called Despina. Despina can be reached in two ways, by ship or by camel. The city displays one face to the traveler arriving overland and a different one to him who arrives by sea. When the camel driver sees at the horizon of the tableland the pinnacle of the skyscrapers that come into the view with the radar antenna and the white socks flapping and the chimneys belching smoke, he thinks of a ship, but he knows it's a city. In the coastline's haze, the sailor discerns the form of a camel, an embroidered saddle, with glittering fringe between the two spotted humps, advancing and swaying. He knows it's a city, but he thinks of the camel. And it was kind of really nice to go back to this passage after almost 28 or 29 years. Now, there's a lot of insightful things that he talks about in this book. So, the whole book is about this discussion, and it's a very, you can see that Kublai Khan is trying to penetrate the mind of Marco Polo, and Marco Polo is constantly trying to avoid falling into traps, and he knows that Kublai is trying to trap him, and he wants to get out of these traps. So the very first discussion talks about, it picks up a moment in the lives of emperors which follow pride in the boundless extension of territories that they have conquered, and the melancholy relief of knowing that soon we'll have to give up any thoughts of knowing them or understanding them. These stories talk of desires as memories. Now Kublai asks him, will my empire last after my life? And he tells him that as you die, you will become an emblem among emblems. These are cities. Are cities images or are they memories? What is the difference between the image and the memory? And one very interesting fact comes up in this when Kublai Khan tells him, you have told me stories of so many cities, but why haven't you told me about your own city, which is Venice? He tells Marco Polo, there is still one which you never speak of. Venice, the Khan says. And Marco Polo replies to this by saying, I'm afraid of losing Venice at once. When I speak of one, I may forget. Or in speaking of other cities, I have already lost it little by little. So in all these discussions, he never speaks about his hometown, which is Venice. But he uses symbols because Marco Polo tells him, every time I describe a city, I'm saying something about Venice itself. Now there are different interpretations. This is a really nice book because in each of these stories, they leave behind some thought with you, some thought of images, some thoughts of interpretation. Like for instance, there's a very, very nice extract when, again, I'll read this for you, I quote, the connections between the elements of the story and another were always not obvious to the emperor because they're talking in symbols. The objects could have various meanings. A quiver filled with arrows could indicate the approach of war or an abundance of game or just an armorer's shop. An hourglass could mean time passing or time passed or sand or just a place where an hourglass is made. So does language then have deceit? Is language true or is language false? I mean, these are kind of constantly they're throwing these little gems at you. So you can actually have, when I went through this book, there's actually like about 2,000 things that I can quote, but maybe that's for a longer discussion, not for like a short, like a 15-minute discussions. There are cities that you constantly keep arriving from. Now, all these cities, obviously, you know that it's like fiction within fiction. There's kind of a narrative there, right? Because you're actually listening to Marco Polo tell stories to Kublai Khan, and you know that Marco Polo himself is making up these stories, and these stories are being narrated to you by Calvino. So there's like just all these stories within stories that are happening. So when you enter a city, are you only entering and don't you ever return? Or is it always a series of entries from one another? So there's a story of the city where you never depart from. Each time you depart from the city, you come back to the same city. So when that happens, what is it? Is it a game that is being played in your mind, or are you actually physically arriving and departing? And Kublai Khan asks him, do these cities really exist? To which Marco Polo says, falsehood is never in words, but in things. There are cities that live as real. He describes cities that live as dead. There are cities that are unborn. And between the living city, the dead city, and the unborn city, there's this intricate relationship that is woven, a web of relationships. And each of these cities and relationships are constantly trying to be born and be manifested and to create forms for themselves. There's another very interesting discussion that they do, and this again I'll read. This again is about, it's again a commentary on reality. Marco Polo is describing a bridge, stone by stone. But which is that stone which supports the bridge? Kublai Khan asks. The bridge is not supported by one stone or another, Marco answers, but by the line of the arch that they form. Kublai Khan remains silent, reflecting, and then he adds, why do you then speak to me of the stones? It's only the arch that matters to me. And Polo answers, without stones, there is no arch. Then there's questioning. If you are happy in the present, are you going to be happy in the beyond? Now, who is alive therefore? Are you alive happy, or are you happy dead? Who is unhappy? The living unhappy or the dead unhappy? The whole book is full of such gems. There are objects with forms, cities with forms, cities which claim that they are God-given, and cities that claim that they are an approximate reflection of the perfection of God. And this is not a religious book. This is all like cynical discussion that they're having. So it's not a discussion on God and religion at all. There's again a discussion on reality. And this is really funny because in this, Kubla says, perhaps this dialogue of ours is taking place between two beggars named Kublai Khan and Marco Polo as they sift through a rubbish heap, piling up rusted flotsam, scraps of cloth, waste paper. While drunk on a few sips of bad wine, they see all the treasure of the East shine around them. To which Polo replies, perhaps all that is left of the world is a wasteland covered with rubbish heaps, and the hanging gardens of the great Khan's palace. It is our eyelids which separate them, but we cannot know which is inside and which is outside. There are cities that he describes which claim that the blueprint is the firmament itself, the sky. Kublai Khan is told by Marco Polo that no one ever listens to all these stories except the Khan himself, because the other listener only retains words that he's expecting. Every unhappy city contains a happy city as its flip, as a coexistence. And every imperfection is the order of gods reflected in a city of monsters. So I'm going to kind of, I think I hit my 15 minutes, but let me just close up with a very, very nice quotation from Hidden Cities chapter. It says, in Raisa, that's the name of the city, a city of sadness, there runs an invisible thread that binds one living being to another for a moment and then unravels. Then is stretched again between moving points as it draws new and rapid patterns, so that at every second the unhappy city contains a happy city unaware of its own existence. So I think I'll kind of stop with that quick thing. And it's really a story that it's really a book that you should read. I'm actually kind of surprised that Calvino is not as well known as he ought to be. He's written also a lot of other books. He's quite a prolific writer. And out two other books that you should look at is one called Mr. Palomar, and he's also written this little gem called Notes for the Next Millennium. Thank you, Professor Rufus. I'm done.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for that insightful insights into invisible cities. You took us on a wonderful tour. If there are any questions for Mr. Venkatesh, you can unmute yourself and ask the questions.
I probably may not be able to answer because I was told,
Okay.
architects love this book because it's very imaginative, and a common test given to students of architecture is like read a chapter and draw it. So there's like constantly people trying to draw it. And there's stories about cities that are in pipes, and constant reference to beggars, constant reference to traders, constant reference to travelers, ships coming in, camels going out. Nymphs bathing is a very common theme that runs through it. Like there are like a half dozen stories of nymphs bathing. So you understand, young students, hot-headed and adrenaline-driven, what they like to draw. So that's kind of a funny thing. But a few years ago, there was an opera made out of it, which was completely panned because obviously it's a very difficult book on which you can make an opera. So no one liked it. So probably if you ask me questions, I don't think I'll be able to answer it.
No, but still we have, memory studies. In memory studies, city forms a vital, point of reference for us. And so, sir, I have a small hypothetical question for you. Like, when you talk about the city, have you seen a city that has been so ideal, as an architect? Have you ever witnessed or have you felt that this is an ideal city, or this is a city, that should be emulated by everyone else, at least try to emulate any city that you can, as an architect, from an architect's point of view?
I'll have to quote, I don't know which page it is, but Marco Polo says that every city is a reflection of our own imperfections. So,
good.
So I don't ever think there's anything perfection, because even if you see something which is perfect, you always try to tinker it in your mind to see how it can become better. But I don't know, I'm not too sure about a perfect city.
Right. Any questions? Any more questions for Mr. Venkatesh? You can unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask your questions.
You can mark one of us as failed. Either I didn't explain properly, so I failed.
No, it was very clearly explained, sir. Very clearly, beautifully explained. I have another question for you.
Is this the translation? Which is what is the original language? Is it the translation?
Yeah, it is a translation from Italian. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Right. So, you were talking about, sir, one last question for you. I was very curious about, this book because, every other reader sports an Italo Calvino book on their reading shelves. I have a host of them. And, when I went to Trichy also, I was invited to a home. Miss Lakshmi and her husband invited me. I saw Italo Calvino stacked up on the shelves. I was so surprised. So, I have a question. Like architects, are you inclusive? Do you involve the aspect of environmental considerations when you, when you think about, this inclusivity? Does environmental, because there is a city here. Yeah.
So, finish your question. I'll answer.
Yeah, there's a city here, that says it was built on 1,000 lakes. So do you think environmental considerations also come into play when it comes to conceptualizing a city?
Our the old cities across civilizations. When I say across civilizations, I mean everything from like the South American civilizations to Egypt to African civilizations to the Chinese, Indians. They all started with a lot of respect for nature because they were all started off on river valleys. They all started near the river. So there used to be a lot of respect for it. But over a period, we completely lost it. So I really do not even think that justifiably whether we can say that we care for the environment, because again there is no civilization or no religion where when you start construction you do not first apologize to the earth for digging into it. You start, every civilization, every religion starts with seeking forgiveness for digging into the earth, for killing insects, for entering their homes to build our homes. But today we pay lip service to it. I really don't think we mean it when we make that apology. It's kind of sad, but we have lost that link with nature. I don't know who, some philosopher said it. I don't know who the philosopher was. He says it's when you lose your touch with nature that you actually need to go to a temple or a church or a mosque. So that's, I mean, I don't know who the philosopher is, but that's what he said.
I think it's J. Krishnamurti, sir, if I'm right. On education, he says that, yes. Thank you, sir, for that wonderful, insightful, enriching, the review for us. I think we're all enriched beyond measure. Thank you, sir. If there are no more questions, thank you to Mr. Venkatesh, and we'll move on to our third delegate of the day. Thank you, sir. Our third delegate of the day, Professor Krishna Dhanasekaran, my colleague at MCC, and she will give us a presentation from Gabriel Garcia Marquez of Love and Other Demons. Over to you, Professor Christina.
Thank you so much, dear Rufus sir, and very good evening to all the participants, and especially the delegates. And the two of you who went before me, you started the innings with, wonderful orientation as well as wonderful reviews. So here I am with this work of a very, very well-known Latin American writer, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who is more affectionately known as Gabo. So we all know that he won the Nobel Prize in 1982, and two of his most popular works and one of his magnum opus until this day is 100 Years of Solitude, and the other one is Love at the Time of Cholera. I think these two books have redefined the world of universe for us, the art world, the universe of art for us. And Gabriel Marquez himself was a very fascinating person who comes from a very small town in the Caribbean region of Colombia. And from there he moves into the city, Bogota, and then he has a stint in Europe. He works as a journalist. He's always wanted to be a writer, but as you would have, the circumstances had forced him to take up publishing and journalism and other things. So he goes to New York. He really strives to make both ends meet. And in the year 1967, when he finally gets to publish 100 Years of Solitude, if the writer had lived that long, it could probably be his years of solitude and even giving birth to a novel like that, because he almost gave up writing. And he's an arduous, not just writer, he's also an editor, that he sits and writes more than some 10 to 20 drafts of his own novel, and sometimes he's just so unhappy with the 5th or the 6th draft, and he can just like trash about some 200 pages which he had sat and wrote or typed using his typewriter, and just be done away with it, because he feels that he was his own critic. He was the first critic that he had to appease in order for his work to be published to the world. And that shows the amount of ridiculous, crazy dedication that he had towards the words as such. So it doesn't really come as a surprise that he won the Nobel Prize, but he was the first Colombian author to win this and turn the spotlight onto Colombia. because you had Pablo Neruda, who won the Nobel Prize in 1971. So the Chilean side of authors had already, reached a platform. But with regard to Colombia, and especially the Caribbean, divisions, the departments of cities that you had there. And he comes from this really small town called Aracataca, which is his inspiration for creating the fictional town of Macondo. So just like how R.K. Narayan's Malgudi and your Hardy's Wessex and other things, you have Macondo, which has been inspired by Aracataca. And it's believed that he stayed with his grandparents until he reached about the age of 8 in this place in Aracataca. So this is a very, very small river town, which is founded along the river Aracataca, and it was founded in 1880s. And when I say river town, it's like we just heard the previous architectural wonders of Venice and Venice-like places. But this is not really a Venice-like place, in the sense the topography was something very difficult to deal with. And people literally had, ramp-raised houses and other places as their dwelling spots. And they had to fight a lot of the anger of the sea in order to keep themselves plonked onto these places. So it wasn't as touristy as it had become in the 90s and 2000 onwards. So early life there in Aracataca meant very, very remote, small, unknown sort of a life. And it had its own fantastical elements, because the minute we say Gabo, we immediately think of magic realism that was greatly implemented and popularized by him. So how did this magic realism really enter his mind space? Thanks to his stay in Aracataca, because the formative years, till about 8, since he stayed there, he used to listen to a lot of stories from his grandparents. So he was not staying with his parents who were working in Bogota. So his grandparents, his grandfather was a colonel, and he always used to talk a lot about political issues. And Marcus himself in certain interviews has said that his grandfather really did not even look at him as a kid. He respected him more like an adult. And because he was surrounded in a house filled with women, and the only two, let's say, men were the grandfather and him. So he said he was more like a sort of a co-conversationalist to his grandfather. And his grandfather used to tell him all kinds of battle adventures to everything. And quite the opposite, where his grandmother used to tell him all kinds of fantastical stories. So he grew up, in a sense, with a slice of realism from his grandfather and all the fantastical notions that you can ever think of from his grandmother. So these were the stories he grew up to, and that is probably probably which gave birth to the fictitious town of Macondo. And I think it also, in most of his short stories, and even if you take the first novel, the 100 Years of Solitude, the most renowned one, there when he talks about 7 generations of the Buenda family, you can just see the scenes which has the ghosts of past, and you can see how something which can be a slice of realism suddenly has a deliberate magical sense of understanding it. Like the perception of these realistic spots become in its description and also in the inferences, it becomes very magical. Because when you say magical realism, how do you really differentiate it from every other part of or forms of literature, different genres of literature? Because to have a bit of realism and fantasy, but I think magical realism comes from, we borrow this term from, the history of painting and especially German art, and they wanted to distinguish it from expressionism and impressionism then. And in the painting circle, the painter's circle, it came to be known as magic realism or magical realism or fantastical realism. And post the 1940s, this term was sort of adopted, in literature, and now it has become a label to describe, Latin American writers. Now, even though Gabo has really popularized magic realism, we should also take it with a pinch of salt, because what I would like to prove today, using this lovely novel out here, Of Love and Other Demons, is how he has been a true historian, apart from being a magic realist writer, because he makes us see what really is that divide, what really is that difference between fact and fiction, and interested in the stories of people, hearing the multiple voices of people. And I think in a colonial sense, when we talk about superstitious nature or superstitious culture, which is always placed against us, the Orient, in one way, when he talks about the Caribbean setting and the culture there, and of South America too, he really questions our notions of what we mean by superstitious, supernatural, and how do we receive stories, and how do we come up with stories as such. So Of Love and Other Demons, like Of Love and Drugs and probably other notions and associations of love we've already heard. This book was published in 1994, and it's a very sort of lesser known work of Gabo. But this work is extremely interesting and intriguing in its treatment of love. Not because of any great plot or storyline here, because the storyline is about a girl who has been bit by a rabid dog, and all the superstitious healing ceremonies and everything that follows this, and of course the period of madness subsequently leading to her death. And how does a small town, how does the village basically look at her? So there is a sort of a deification that happens, where some part of the town believe her to be, a super healer or something, that she's got certain powers because of this, the rabid bite of the dog. And the other part basically demonizes her. So I think what is the infection that spreads here is basically the emotions of these people. And I'll go on to tell you why when I'm reading the excerpts of the novel. So so when he invents this fictitious town of Macondo, even though he doesn't really place the novel here, you can see a lot of instances of Arakataka coming in, especially when you talk about the Roman Catholic traditions, the superstitious legendary stories, the women in the household, the way he describes all of these things. And he, in most of the stories, the two different ages of say the human life that Gabo is very interested in is, one is childhood and old age. Like if you take 100 Years of Solitude and also Love in the Time of Cholera, I mean, especially in Love in the Time of Cholera, with the backdrop of a terrible disease, and I think we can relate well to it now, being in a pandemic ourselves. And in that background, when he talks about the bitter smell of almonds and places, a sort of a love triangle inside that novel, unlike any other love triangle, let's say, and takes us through different phases of the characters, right from their childhood to old age. And I don't think anyone could have ever, with such empathy, described old age to us. Like it's not a wisdomous old age he's talking about. It's not a passive, resigned old age that he's talking about. Like, in fact, when you read the novels, most of his characters are more interesting to us, when they pass the age of 60 and 70, and especially when you give up on saying, okay, what's more there to life, like you become senile and everything. Now in Love in the Time of Cholera, he defines the love between two old people, and the sort of conversation they have in their senility. It's just so criticizing an old couple there, but it's just talking about the minutiae of everyday life that's lived by these people. So the same thing you have here in this novel also, when you take the main character of Sierva Maria, and this you could almost call it a novella, because it's a novel with slightly long 5 chapters only, and it's hardly 150 plus pages. So for my review, I'm using the translation by Edith Grossman. And when you take the setting here, I just want to read the dedication and other things before I step into the novel as such. So apart from other things, Gabo is known for the friendship that he has, with both within his literary circle and outside too. And this book he dedicates for Carmen Balcells, who she was his literary agent. And I think a dedication to a sort of, it's very sweet gesture to tell us how beautiful it is. And also Gabo was one person who had who enjoyed great friendship with Bill Clinton as well as Fidel Castro during his time. And as in, the author was born in 1927 and he passed away in 2014. But somebody who sort of enjoyed praise and friendship beyond borders, I think it was only Gabriel Marquez. He did get little politically involved in order to publicize his novels and everything, but I mean, that bit of marketing of a writer was there. But I don't think anybody would have been that friendly with all these world leaders, and especially during your entire your Cold War period. And he was able to stay in touch with the diplomats of both the places as such. And coming back to the novel, he begins it with an epigraph quoting Thomas Aquinas. Epigraph to the novel, I'm just going to read it. For the hair, it seems, is less concerned in the resurrection than other parts of the body. So he's talking about hair and head hair. And this is a quote from On the Integration of Resurrected Bodies by Thomas Aquinas. So why is he giving an epigraph from, say, the 14th, 15th century Italian philosopher? And talking about, do you really think that hair is going to regenerate when you are worried about, your medieval concepts of regeneration and your soul and body and mind and things like that? So he starts it with a very quizzical question as such. And also, in a very demystifying sense, he begins it with a quote of Thomas Aquinas, because I think after probably Charles Lamb, when you take the course of writers down the ages from all cultures, Marquez is also another person who who loves to mystify his readers. Like he has written what seems to be a serious author's note here about how he got so fascinated about this character. Like, what is real about Sierra Maria, you're going to ask, when I'm talking about magic realism novel, right? So he leaves a note here. And apparently, like, as a journalist, when he was working, he went for one of those investigative pieces. And I'm just going to read a few excerpts from that, which is going to give us a bit of premise for our story. October 26, 1949 was not a day filled with important news. Maestro Clement Manuel, the editor-in-chief of the newspaper where I learned the essentials of being a reporter, concluded our morning meeting with 2 or 3 routine questions. He did not assign a specific story to any writer. A few minutes later, he was informed by telephone that the burial crypts of the old convent of Santa Clara were being emptied, and with few illusions, he said to me, "Stop by there and see if you can come up with anything." So this convent of Santa Clara is named after the convent of Santa Clara in Seville, Spain. But this is in a place called Cartagena. And again, this is one of the regions of the Colombian divisions of the Caribbean divisions of Colombia. And the historical convent of the Clarician nuns, Santa Clara, was a place where people who were affected with insanity, also, especially women, it served as a sort of a safe haven and asylum for these people. So what he goes to investigate is how this particular place is now being razed down, and as quietly and without in an unfussing manner, the graves of that particular nunnery is being brought down, raised down, and a tourist 5-star hotel is to be built in that place. So he, in just a few lines from the serious author's note, he seems to be dismissing it. But if he really infers something for it, he tells us almost like how our activist, Kate Trask, talks about the evils of tourism, especially in the islands of Hawaii. So for us, it becomes a place of like, aloha, welcome, and everything is nice. Or even if you take the island of Jamaica or most of these archipelagos, that we don't really understand what it has done to the people who are living there and those ancestral, cultural heritage that they hold on to. So here again, like all those traditions of this beautiful town and the people who lived there are now just being completely razed down. And he goes there and he finds a lot of red tapeism happening, and some supervisors are out there and they're just piling bones one on top of each other, and they just leave a little label on top saying that, okay, these bones belong to this particular person. If we have any descendants, they can come and claim it, but otherwise we are basically converting this entire cemetery, like this is not the place of dead anymore. And as funny as the narration of the author's note goes, it is a very serious thing, because the sort of one of the very important rituals that we have in a person's life is definitely the funeral and the burial scene. And whether be it any culture or whether be it any religion or whether be it any tribal community, the place of burial is considered holy and sacred. And you find that these people are just losing that sort of respect that you give to the dead. And right from our Greek Antigone, we have seen how people have struggled to pay the respect to their beloved, unfortunately dead ones. And we've even had like lovely movies made on during what had happened during the dictatorship of Pinochet, if you take the Chilean side of South America, where I think this film is called Nostalgia for the Light, yeah, where you have women who are wandering around in the Atacama Desert to find the remains, to just basically collect the mementos, the bones of their loved ones as such, who had been terribly massacred during the time of Pinochet. And it contrasts with astronomers trying to find out from the quintessence of dust, they're trying to reconstruct a history of humankind. And it's just the way in which he begins the novel itself, like it's almost like there is no surprise, there's no plot suspense or anything, because he has been told in his childhood, probably by his grandmother, that there was this girl who was, when she was around 12 years old, was bit by a rabid dog. And as I told you, half the town considered her a sort of a goddess and or a demigod who suddenly possessed certain supernatural powers of healing. And on the other side, half the town really considered her as insane and mad, and that she was a demon and she needs to be exorcised, which resulted in her death later on when she's taken and put into a convent. And apparently her grave is also here, that she is also resting here. So towards the last paragraph of this author's note, he goes on to tell us that suddenly when the foreman was cracking down one of the graves, he found a skull. And in that story, when he was being told the story in the childhood, something that stuck onto him was that this girl by name Sierra Maria had beautiful copper hair that almost grew, to her ankles. So I think even this thought, and the character of Sierra Maria, after reading the novel, haunted me. And I think the second woman to haunt me with her hair after Rapunzel would definitely be Sierra Maria. And when the foreman cracks open the grave, he finds a skull with hair. And the hair goes on and on for about some, good 22 meters when they lay it out. Now, we have no idea if this really did happen or not, because just like how in his stories, I told you, he just loves to mystify us. So he leaves us in a limbo of whether this really took place or not. And when you are really wondering about, is that because that's the author's note, and even before you could start with the fantastical first paragraph of the novel, you already get into a world of fantasy there. And this is how your first chapter begins. An ash-gray dog with a white blaze on its forehead burst onto the rough terrain of the market on the first Sunday in December. It knocked down tables of fried food, overturned Indian stalls and lottery kiosks, and it bit 4 people who happened to cross its path. 3 of them were black slaves. The 4th, Sierra Maria de Todos Los Angeles, the only child of Marcus de Cassider with a mulatto servant, to buy a string of bells for the celebration of her 12th birthday. And thus begins our story to unravel. So in these lines, you could see how 4 people cross the path of the dog. And the dog serves as a sort of a MacGuffin sort of a device, like how you use in thrillers. Like if you watched all of you should have watched your Hitchcock's Psycho, where it begins with the issue of the money that the protagonist, she steals, and then we just don't get any information about it, so that device is just to like catapult us into the story. So here again, the dog acts as almost as a person and catapults everybody into the story. And the casual mention of it also bit 3 black slaves, but nobody cares about it because that's just sort of deleted history. So he brings in the problem between white ethnicity. He also, by not tells us how important it is to take the different ethnic groups who were surviving in that place. And that's why I told you, like, he's a better historian than most people, because using elements of fantasy, he tries to portray to us stories that we have essentially forgotten to report, to document, and hence questions this idea of history, whether it be a record of facts even, right? So so this goes on, and the girl has sort of a troubled relationship with her parents, and her mother is the 3rd or the 4th wife of the father. The father again is a man who was very unhappily trapped in most of his marriages because he had to listen to his parents. And most of the time, these marriages, the young ones do not have any say. They just have to give in to the traditions of the people, the elders in their family. And you see that Sierra Maria also gets into this sort of a trap, just like how you have it in 100 Years of Solitude. And what happens to her is she grows up in the slave quarters of the mansion. And she is well versed in all the African tongues. And the main matron there is, she's a Yoruban from one of the West African tribes. And she teaches her all kinds of, from magic to black art to whatever it is. And Sierra Maria seems to believe that she is one of the slaves, rather than believing that she is the daughter of the Marquis and a well-known and a rich man of the town. So as she goes to the marketplace to buy these belts and other things, and she's a person who lets her hair grow, and she's never cut her hair because there's a story to it that it was a complicated pregnancy, and her mother, Bernarda, she prayed to the god saying that if she is born alive and she lives up to see her teen years, then she would never cut the hair of the child. So that's the speciality of her hair. And she's known as a sort of a totemic presence that she has, throughout the novel. And okay, for paucity of time, I think I've already exceeded the time limit. So I'm going to quickly give you an overview of this. And then as you move on into the other chapters, you get to know the story of how the parents, their marriage was consummated and or even arranged and things like that. So what you find here is throughout when he's describing Sierra Maria getting bit by the rabid dog, never does he use any jargon to do with disease or illness or infection. But when he's talking about, other important characters, like another important character is Father Catino de Lora, who is sent to exorcise Sierra Maria, because after the rabid dog's bite, she doesn't show much symptoms. But as you know, that rabies symptoms can vary from 3 months to even a year, and it's a neurotropic disease that's going to affect your nerves. And by the time the symptoms show up, it's going to be difficult. And the way those times people dealt with rabies itself had its own aura of tropes. I'm reminded of this 1958 film of Ingmar Bergman, the Swedish director who gave us this idea of close-up shots. And if you watch his film called Rabies, interestingly, it's a 1958 drama. It's a must-watch, because it tells us the idea of that madness of rabies is brought to the forefront with just the slightest of things, like having a bad day could result in you being infected with terrible negative emotions for the rest of your life. And I think that's the crux of this novel, because Sierra Maria seems to be so vivacious. She doesn't show any symptoms of madness, but everybody around her start to think of those symptoms of madness. It's almost like the Night of the Scorpion, where the scorpion bite, and then everybody else is so focused on the scorpion and its bite and think all kinds of things about what's going to happen to the mother. The same thing happens to Sierra Maria as well. And at one stage, the father cannot handle it anymore, and he falls a prey to all the rumors in the town that he goes and leaves her in this particular convent, and he even is okay with ordering an exorcism for her. And this is when we get introduced to the character of the bishop and his protege, who is Father Catino. Father Catino de Lora is sent to a prison-like setting that Sierra Maria has been put in this nunnery. And he takes pity on her first, and because just this young girl, like just 12 years old, and he starts to care for her. He starts to apply poultices to her wounds and everything, because she's gone through horrendous, torturous experiences of people trying, and from witch doctors to everybody who have tried to heal her apparently of rabies. And you find that the father, very slowly, he falls in love with this girl, and he beats himself to it. So, sorry, sir.
2 more minutes. 2 more minutes.
Sure. Right. So yeah, so he beats himself because he even flagellates himself in one particular juncture, because he's totally divided between his dedication to the divine and to the love that he has here. So in one particular line in chapter 3 or 4, I think it goes, where he says, Father de Lora was infected by his own emotions. So he is a person who wants to maintain a library, for the bishops and others, and he's a very learned man, and he's never understood why certain books were banned from, the Catholic indices of books which are banned from these people to read it. So he's a person who's always been questioning, but still stuck inside the cogs of the very, very strict structure of Catholicism. So with this girl, he's able to see that probably the madness is the madness of everybody else who's imagining her to be mad, and not this person. So he starts to, recite poetry to her. He starts to meet her in secret. He gets to, sort of dive into a tunnel and get to her place in the night. But we get to see that there's not really a sexual relationship between the two, but they do fall in love. They profess their love for each other. And as I told you, it ends as a Greek play almost. Like you doomed to know that, the father is going to be penalized for his actions. And at the end, the lovers are separated, and she dies on a marble plank, being exorcised by the bishop. And the bishop gets extremely angry when he knows that his protege, the young bishop, the young father has fallen in love with this girl who he was supposed to exorcise in the first place. So towards the end, you find the poor girl, her hair is completely tonsured, and she meets with her death after the horrible ritual of exorcism that happens, and she starves herself to death, wondering where the father had gone and why hasn't he come to save her. But unknown to her, he has been penalized by the bishop, and he has been sent to another convent where he has to serve lepers, and he does everything possible in order to contract leprosy, but he's unsuccessful. And the story ends with him just being there at the water trough, trying to get himself desperately get himself infected so that he could die of leprosy. Now, the thing about the novel is Of Love and Other Demons, like I think you can see both the ideas of deification and demonification that happens here with an extreme emotion of love. And what is interesting is, as I told you in the beginning itself, that through these superstitious narratives, he's able to, in a non-judgmental fashion, he without reducing the sympathy and empathy we could have to the victim, Sierra Maria, he also tells us why others spoke of it like this. Like, it wasn't intentionally anyone's girl's life miserable, but because of the mindset issue and because of what they believed in. I mean, you can see the witch hunt that goes on in our media, like, currently, and you all know, like, it's a great distraction from COVID and our tumbling economy and everything else. But how easy it is for us to demonize a person, how easy it is for us to deify a person. So I think I should leave this novel with those anchor questions as such.
Thank you so much, Professor DC, Professor Krishna Dhanasekaran, for that wonderful review. It was engaging, insightful as well on Garbo. Any questions for Professor DC? You can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Good evening.
In the meantime, yes.
Good evening. Thank you, ma'am, for your very elaborate and wonderful review. The moment I was listening to you, I am reminded of this Tangled film, where Rapunzel, you have a character, and with her magical hair. I'm really happy to listen to you. And Sierra, the supernatural girl with her supernatural power of healing and other talents too, like her influence and fluency in other African languages, and all these positive side of it. She died, and after that, her magical hair grows, I think. So is there any relevance to the core theme of the novella? And it's like a tragedy, and the theme is like it's love. So I couldn't get that. So already we know that tragedy, all the love is in tragical tone. But here I have two questions. Is there any relevance of her growing magical hair after her death? And then what is her death? Is there any significance about her death there in the novella?
Yeah, so the first thing about the hair is, that's why I think he begins with that epigraph of Thomas Aquinas, where Aquinas says your hair and nails and other things don't matter much, because when you regenerate in that era of salvation you get into, these things don't matter. But that's why he, he ironically quotes that, and he begins the novel with this girl with beautiful hair which has never had the scissors work on it, and towards the end it's all tonsured and she loses it, and but then the author's note leaves us with 22 meters of free flowing golden hair that the foreman finds out from the grave. So it's a sort of a cyclic reality. You don't know where the beginning of the story is. Did it really end? Did she ever exist? And things like that. So in which case, if I'm going to look at her as, well, yes, there may have been this human who did undergo this, rabid dog's bite, then I'm not too sure if we should look at it only as a tragedy, because I feel that this is the tragedy of a society which has lost its stories, because the entire, story of Sierra Maria is only a backdrop. It's just a main narrative. Like, when you read through the chapters, you would know all these characters have some ghost of the past that's haunting them. And they've all become a prey of circumstances. They've all become a prey of another person's story. Now imagine if we are all characters who are trapped in another person's story. and they are writing our stories right now. And it's not too difficult to imagine. That's what happens in life also. Most of the times we give it the best of the shot, but still we cannot control that decision because another person is scripting what the next scene of our life is going to be. And if it works out for us, then we call it a comedy that ends in wedding bells, or it's a beautiful life. But if it doesn't end for us, then we call it a tragedy. So I think Marcus is trying to make us see both these visions, both as a happy comic vision and also as a happy tragic vision. And he just wants to show to us that what can be seen as comedy can suddenly become very tragic in your life. Like we can never demarcate these two things.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
I hope that answered it. Thank you so much.
I'm so happy. I'll get the book and I'll read. Thank you.
Thank you. That's the best compliment I can get. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for that wonderful question, and Professor DC for that lively answer. If there are any other questions for Professor Christina Dhanasekaran, you can unmute yourself and ask a question. Professor DC, I have a small question for you.
Yes, sir.
I think there is someone who's that voice should be muted, I think. Here, I think, Sierra Maria seems not to be a master or in full control of her own destiny. That's from a critical perspective, right? She has always been objectified or possessed. She has been pitied, and she doesn't seem to have agency in this novella. So do you think, he's trying to also put, she has been also compared to animals, satanic, forces in her, So do you think he's trying to tell us about the plight of the woman also?
Definitely, to a great extent. Like, because the novel showcases very interesting and strong women in the character of matrons, like the person who leads the slave quarters, the black slave quarters there inside the mansion. Even Bernarda's character, like, later on she becomes a very vindictive sort of a wife, and she just becomes a very bitter person and everything. The complexity of women is how it is shown here is that they are being affected by certain things and they are being hurt, and out of that wound they start to bleed on the others that they are meeting later on in their life as well. Like, that wound continues to ooze out that pus. I mean, sorry for the imagery, but in one sense that's what happens. Like, they're unhealed, and when they're unhealed, even though they could meet someone who dearly cares for them, it still ends up being a tragedy. That's what happens in the case of Sierra Maria meeting a lovely, caring, Father Ketano, who, despite his vows, falls in love with her. But there's no sexual sort of a ravishing thought in his mind. He truly, deeply cares for her.
Thank you. That was a very intense observation, intense, poignant, and very, very moving observation that you made. It carries forward, right, in some other form. Good. Thank you. If there are no other questions for Professor Christina Dhanasekaran, we'll move on to our last delegate for the day, Miss Yamini. I think this is also a very intense and a poignant story that she's giving us a review, right? A very poignant one. And without much ado, and we move on to our last delegate. Before that, in case you have a beautiful book that you are waiting to share with us, you have your favorite book, any book under the sun that you would love to share with us. Sir, I have a book, right? You can contact us. We have 1 or 2 slots remaining on the 19th and the 9th and the 16th of October. You could just ping us messages about your favorite book of yours. We will be glad to have you share just a 10 or 15 minute review from your favorite book. Thank you. Now over to Miss Yamini.
Thank you, sir. Good evening all, and thank you, Professor, for giving me this opportunity. The book I chose to review is Bitter Chocolate by Pinky Virani. Actually, why I chose this book is this book is one of my research books during my MPhil distinctions, and this book was suggested by my former professor and guide, Dr. Ganesh, and I have to be very thankful for him. Frankly speaking, I'm not a very good lover of non-fictions. I usually read novels. This
there
book
seems to
totally
be
changed
some
my mindset.
Miss Yamini, there seems to be some breaking in your voice. Something seems to break in your voice. Yeah. It's not quite audible. Maybe you can try changing the audio or something like that.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes.
Okay, sir. So this book, Bitter Chocolate, is all about
just a minute. If you have any other audio, you can mute it. Because there's an echo.
Oh, there's no other audio, sir.
Okay. There seems to be some echo.
Oh, okay. Hold on a second. I will use another.
Yeah, please. Yeah, we can wait. No problem.
Now, sir?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. Okay, sir. So this novel, this non-fiction, Bitter Chocolate, is all about the child sexual abuse that happened, especially in India, particularly in India. It's like happening in our homes, right? So Pinky Virani is an Indian writer and as well as a journalist. She is also an activist. She fought for many social causes. Her first book, Aruna Story, that was written in 1998, deals with the case of nurse Aruna. Some of you might know her, nurse Aruna. Even now, is it not audible, sir?
Yes, a bit. Maybe.
Okay.
There seems to be an echo somewhere. Maybe you should.
Shall I turn on my video, sir? If it's okay.
Oh yeah, yes, it's okay. It's okay. No problem.
Okay, sir. So now, sir?
Clear, very clear.
Oh, sorry for the disturbances. Okay, so we'll continue with that. So her first story is about Aruna Shanbagam. Most of you would know her. She's a nurse who is working in a very famous hospital. She was brutally raped by her co-worker and was in a semi-coma for more than 15 years. She also wrote about her the story of Aruna, and she also worked immensely for the passing of law of passive euthanasia. That is a law for intentionally killing a human or an animal for humane reasons, actually. So her third work is Bitter Chocolate. So she also worked in this non-fiction work. She talk about the child sexual abuse and child rapes and who are all responsible for this child abuse. And after publishing this novel, the Madras High Court recommended this book to other courts in order to practice some of the laws or some of the suggestion that was given in this book. One of the suggestion that given in this book by Pinky Virani is the victim, the child victim, should not attend the court in physically. She is not it is not a compulsion to attend the court. Okay, the child can record her trial or record her words in an audio tape or a video tape and can produce it in a court, or the child can allot a separate lawyer or a counselor where she or he can talk with them. So this avoided the child to re-traumatize. Actually, when a child who is being sexually abused, when she faces her abuser, she will have a re-traumatization. She will go through the same sexual abuse once again whenever she see her abuser. So this was the one of the recommendation that the Madras High Court personally preferred from Pinky Virani's book. So I'll move on to the book. So this book is divided into 3 chapters. The first one is Notebook 1, the second is Notebook 2, and the third is Notebook 3. In Notebook 1, Pinky Virani gave us a clear description of what is child sexual abuse and how many cases are there in India. And then she'll give a clear description about boy victims and girl victims also. So usually child abuse always related to girls. we fail to address the boy childs who are going through the child abuses. So she frankly talk about the boys also, and she also noted down, collected many real incidents as a story, and she also mentioned that stories in this book also. The second chapter, Notebook 2, deals with the laws that passed related to child abuse, child sexual abuses. Notebook 3 deals with the counseling part, actually, or the psychiatric department, the trauma, and the therapy, and so on. And the helpline book also available in the end of this book. Okay, so we'll move on to first the author note. Actually, Pinky Virani is also one of a victim of child sexual abuse. In her, at her age, at around 10 years old, when she was 10 years old, she was sexually abused by her own uncle. And this fact was clearly known by her father also. Her father knew about this abuse, but he kept quiet about this matter. So through this, her own story, she tried to say that in Indian community, sex is the word which was highly muted, or we can call it as hushed word in Indian community. Everyone is not very open about this word sex. They restrict this word, they feel very sensitive toward this word. But this is the same community where child sexual abuse are the deepest and most jointly held secret also. So these families who are all very restricted to the word sex are the one who are keeping it as a secret also. This book also deals with many questions. So Pinky Virani questions the society about the social norms. She also talked about the sexual threats that was faced by both the boys and girl victim. She also talked about the parenting failure. Parenting failure is one of the cause of child sexual abuse, actually. So we always want our children to be very careful with the strangers. We always want, don't talk with the stranger, or don't get anything from the stranger. So what it comes to our own family members, what it comes to our own mother and father, own sister and brothers, we say that home is the very safest place in the earth. But after reading this book, I thought that home is a hell in some cases. Home acts as a hell for some people, some children who are sexually abused by their own family members. Even the government statistic details says that 90.5% of child sexual abuse are happening by the family members, not by the strangers or not by the neighbors, but by the family members, close family members. And then she also mentioned about many writers who wrote about this sexual abuse. For example, Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou is a great writer. She's also a child abuse victim. At the age of 9 or 10, she was physically, sexually abused by her mother's partner. And another writer, Pinky Virani mentioned, is Toni Morrison. Her novel, The Bluest Eye, clearly described the child sexual abuses, how parents fail to protect their children. Let's move on to the victims, that is the girl or the boy child who is being sexually abused. So most of us will talk about a girl child. The sexual abuse, the topic sexual abuse comes means we'll all talk about the girl child. What about the boy child? I personally had an experience that one of my friend, when I'm doing research for my dissertation, one of my close friend revealed his secret that he was also sexually abused by his own uncle in his childhood. That was a very shocking revelation for me. And after that, I inquired many of my friends, male friends. They also shared their what we call as their stories about the sexual abuse. So this sexual abuse is happening for both genders, female and male also. And next, talk about the mindset of the victims. After a sexual abuse, how will be the mindset of the victims? So the first things that comes to the mind of the victim is fear. because they are children, right? They were not that much capable or confident enough to tell this to their parents. First of all, they don't know what is sexual abuse itself. They were not aware of this subject, because we, being a parents, we are not very much frank with the children, or very much open with the children about the subject sex. So first thing, they don't know what is sexual abuse itself. Next, the fear about the abusers. Sometimes the abusers threaten the victims not to tell the truth. Second is the shame and guilt. Some of the victims have this idea that they are responsible for all the things that are happening to them. They self-blame themselves for all the things that are happening. Because why is happening to me? Because I am wrong. That's why it's happening to me. That is the self-guilt and shame they face. Next is judgment of the society. They felt afraid to confess these things to their parents or to the society, because they will have a judgment. So these are the things Pinky Virani shares in Notebook 1. She also share one of the story. I want to share one of the stories that Pinky Virani's mentioned. It is a story about a 3-month-old girl, Vaishali. She is a 3-month-old girl. She is when her parents is living in her home. His father went to work. Her father went to work. Her mother is taking care of her, and there is a servant, a 14-year boy servant, was working in that home. So one day, the girl's uncle noted that this girl is sexually abused. For some reason, she came to know about this 3-month-old girl was being sexually abused by this servant. At the end of that day, what happened is, the mother got a slap from her father, and the boy was fired from the work. That's all. The problem solved. The mother got a slap, and the boy was fired from the work. So that was the minimal thing we do when this sexual abuse come to our contact. So it is the right thing. When we think about it's the right thing, is no. This boy again go to another house as a servant and will do the same thing to another child. That was Pinky Virani is trying to say, that very harshful punishments are not there in our law for this abusers or perpetrators, we call them as. Next, she talk about the statistic details. According to the statistic details, till 2016, 62.5% of girls and 37.5% of boys below the age of 15 are being sexually abused in India. This is the statistic details that Pinky Virani's give. Another is the guilt the boy or the girl face, the degree of guilt. The high degree of guilt will lead them to a mental and physical torture. They get into a stage where they have been traumatized, post-traumatic stress disorder. That was the result of most of the child victim. And next comes the question, who are these abusers? Why are they doing like this to our children? So in half of the cases, this abusers, child abusers, are once a victim themselves. In their childhood, they somehow being abused by their family members or being abused by their neighbors. Slowly, when they grow, they fond of create this character. They also wanted to abuse others. They wanted to give the pain they face to other children. That is in one case. And in other cases, it's for the mere pleasure, just for the lust. They are doing this for the children. Actually, childhood is the best memories a person, human being could have. It is a very fruitful memory. Whenever we think about our childhood, it is a very fruitful memory. But to the children who have been the victim of child abuse, their childhood memories are like unpleasant thing, unforgettable nightmares. They are haunted by this abuse repeatedly in their lives. And the next thing, the important thing, Pinky Virani talk about the counselors and psychiatrists that are available in India. So we have a very minimal amount of psychiatrists and counselors in India. So it is very difficult for the counselors and psychiatrists to understand the behavior and thought process of the child victims. Simply they will prescribe some downers medicines to them to numb the pain or to numb the memories, but it is not the correct treatment. In such case, I want to add another case. It is about a boy who is 10-year-old. He was continuously abused by his uncle till the age of 10. Okay, so one day he somehow said no to his uncle, and after 5 years he keep on having this nightmare about his uncle and the sexual abuse. So he started to wash his body 10 times a day, and it's gradually increased to 100 times a day. He even developed a skin rashes because of the amount of time he bath himself with the very hot water. This is another kind of trauma the children are face after a severe child abuse. We also call this as a smiling depression or a masked depression. The adults who have faced child abuses in their childhood always smile. They don't show their depression outside. They mask this depression with a smile. And another thing is the parenting failure. Parents are failed, both the genders, like the mother and the father, both are failed to listen to their children. They always think children as a small liars. They might lie. This is the concept of parents. They might lie for minimal matters. So they don't trust their own children, and they treat them as small liars sometimes. In some cases, I'm not talking about all the parents. There are some parents who are supporting their children during such cases, but there are parents who are not even ready to face this problem by themselves, or they are not ready to face the children's or face the relatives who cause this problem. And I'll finally want to read a poem from this book. This poem was written by a 12-year-old girl about her abuse. I asked you for help and you told me you would. If I told you the things he did to me, you asked me to trust you and you made me repeat them to 14 different strangers. I asked you for help and you gave me a doctor with cold hands who spread my legs and stared at me just like my father. I asked you for protection and you gave me a social worker. Do you know what it is like to have more social worker than friends? I asked you for help and you forced my mother to choose between us. She chose him, of course. She was scared. She had a lot to lose. I had a lot to lose too. The difference is you never told me how much. I asked you to put an end to the abuse. You put an end to my whole family. You took away my nights of hell and gave me days of hell instead. You have changed my private nightmare into a very public one. This is a poem written by a 12 years old girl. This poem was displayed in the notice board of a counseling center actually. It is a very shocking revelation of a girl, how she faced multiple abuse, not only physical but emotional and psychological abuse, not only by the victim, not only by the abuser, but also by her parents, also by the social workers, also by the doctors. So finally, Pinky Virani's through this book made us to realize and made us to look deep into the reality check what is happening inside our home, what is happening to our child. And she also insists that sex education, this topic should be discussed among children. It will give an awareness to children what is happening to their body, what is happening to their innocence, and what is happening to their childhood. So that's all about this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yamini, for that wonderful, poignant, intense, review. It moved our hearts, and you literally stole all our hearts. And if there are any questions for Ms. Yamini, you can unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask a question.
So, hello, Yamini. This is Jaipriya.
Hi, ma'am.
It was a great presentation. I would love to talk with you personally. I think I have messaged Rufus too. And you have taken all the relevant points which has to be spoken in such a forum or so. When you started talking about the child sexual abuse and you brought in the parental failure, I have faced it. Yeah, because I am a counselor for this child sexual abuse, where I go talk to certain people and rescued certain of them and have put them to counselors. I can very well understand what actually happens, and it's a great work, Ma. My heartfelt appreciations to you, and I will talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. That's great to hear.
Thank you, Jaipriya ma'am, for that wonderful, observation. Any other questions for Ms. Yamini? You can unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask a question.
Okay. Can I ask a question again, Rufus, if nobody is asking?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Yamini, there are people who never speak about the child sexual abuse of boys, right? You chose to spoke on that. You chose to speak on that. And as you were speaking, I just wanted to ask you, and you'll be narrating certain incidents that happened to your friends also. And what was the of those boys? How did they rescue themselves, or what is the mental trauma that they underwent, and what solutions you gave them? Are they out of it? How are they?
Yes, ma'am. The first thing when I'm approached my friend is when he's narrating his story, the first thing he felt is guilt or shame. Because being a boy and being sexually abused by another man or a woman, he felt shame, and he have an identity crisis also. Like, why a male have to sexually abuse me? That was the question that's keep on ringing in his mind. The first thing he faces guilt and shame, and what is the solution he got is nothing. He just tried to move with the guilt and shame and with the what we call unpleasant memories. What I suggested to him is to talk with your parents. You have to first talk with your parents. You have to confess them what happened to you as a child. And also I asked him to be very free to talk with me, because many of us, many male child, especially female child also, were not ready to talk about this subject publicly, or to even to their close friends also they were hesitate to talk about this subject. So I just support them to talk, just clear their mind. We cannot share their pain, but I just hear them what they speak, and just a little bit we can share their what we call this their nightmares, I think so.
But they
That
normally
was I
don't.
said.
They normally don't share, right?
Yes,
there
yes,
is a
ma'am.
kind of social withdrawal, like those are the symptoms with which we can understand.
Yes, ma'am.
Like, yeah, they are actually abused sexually, right? And as you
Yes.
say, parents will not accept. They would say, no, this will not happen in my home. This is what I have seen when parents say, no, idu yan veetla nadakadu. This is how they used to speak.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
But that it happens in their home. Sonda mama, those people will be doing this, as you narrated certain incidents. Yeah, this is very true, and thank you for the insight. And I would love to read that book also. Thank you, Yamini. Thanks for introducing it.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your kind words.
Thank you, ma'am. Actually, that was a very intense observation, because we make these sweeping generalizations,
yes,
on behalf of the family honor. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. And so what happens is the feeling of fear, guilt, and shame that a person has to undergo prevents him or her from coming out. I'm happy Pinky Virani has been inclusive in it. And as Jaipriya ma'am has pointed out, even boys undergo this trauma. So yes, ma'am. If any other observation?
Rishi here.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Can I say something?
Yes, ma'am. You're welcome.
Actually, without, at the risk of making a generalization, I would like to say that there's a cultural aspect to this, because this seemingly happens more often in families where spaces are shared, and like a joint family, and or a whole lot of cousins staying together, and as Sir said, protecting family honors there. So in this case of abuse, or in any case of abuse, the parents or figures of authority in the family, they go into denial, not because they don't believe that it has happened. They go into denial because they want to hold things together. They want to hold the system together, because there is some kind of interdependence and cooperation in the family, and they do not want to upset.
That's right. That's a very good observation, ma'am. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
so I would like to answer for that. It's not only happening in joint families; it's also happening in nuclear family, where the where the relatives visits rarely. So this is also happening. And another thing is the parents or like think about their relatives and their family names, but they don't think about their child's future. There is a small child who is broken, devastated. There is no future for her. She's being traumatized inside. She is like devastated inside. She's a broken piece actually from inside. They think about the other family members, their systems, the societies, but not about their child. So that is a very shocking part and very sad part also. So that was I want to share.
Good.
Yes.
Very good, ma'am.
Yeah, that's it.
Any other observations or comments or questions for Ms. Yamini? I think, this is a wonderful book, a very intense, poignant book that we have discussed. And, that takes up a very relevant social issue that has been playing our time since time memory, not only in India, but all over the world. And one writer had the guts to take her pen and write down her thoughts and put it very boldly, in pen and paper. And now it has reached even the lawmakers that they've included her in framing laws against child sexual abuse. And so, this is the power of literature. When you have a thought like a Maya Angelou, you need not wait for a Maya Angelou to pen her thoughts, need not wait for a Pinky Virani to pen her thoughts. If you have something that pains you, or something that, affects you, you can immediately pen it down. Any other questions for Ms. Yamini, or I think we'll call it today, right? So thank you everyone, participants, for being with us this evening. It was a wonderful, memorable evening. Next week, same time, 6 p.m., we all meet again for another eventful 9th edition of Books and Coffee. Till then, stay tuned. It's bye-bye from all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, God.